Snow had come early that year, settling over the county before the last of the harvest was properly in, and the Duke of Ellesmere stood at the frosted window of his carriage and watched the white fields slide past, and felt none of the peace that snow was supposed to bring. He was traveling home from London, where he had spent 3 weeks doing what dukes were expected to do. Attending dinners he did not wish to attend, listening to conversations that circled, always, back to the same question dressed in 100 different gowns. When will His Grace choose a bride? Edmund Hale, Duke of Ellesmere, was 32 years old, and he had buried a father, a mother, and 4 years past, a young wife, dead of a fever within the first year of their marriage, before she had ever truly become more to him than a stranger in his house. He had not gone looking for love in that marriage. It had been arranged, as such things were, and he had told himself at the time that fondness would grow in its own season, the way it did for most people of his class. It had not had the chance to grow before it was buried alongside her. Since then, he had built around himself a kind of quiet, careful distance. He attended what he must. He gave what was expected. His name to charitable subscriptions, his presence at the necessary dinners, his signature on papers his steward brought him. But he had stopped, somewhere in those 4 years, believing that warmth was a thing he was likely to find again, and he had stopped, if he was honest with the coldest part of himself, looking very hard for it. His carriage broke an axle 2 miles outside the village of Thornfield, on a lane gone treacherous with ice, as the light was beginning to fail. "We'll not have it mended before dark, Your Grace," his coachman said, crouched beside the wheel with a lantern, his breath fogging in the cold. "There's an inn in the village. I'll send word ahead, and we'll have you comfortable within the hour." Edmund, restless with the stillness of the broken carriage and unwilling to sit idle in the cold while his men worked, told his coachman he would walk on ahead into the village himself. He took no footman. He wanted, for once, the simple, unremarkable business of walking a country lane alone, without the weight of eyes that recognized his crest on the carriage door. He had gone perhaps half a mile when he heard it. A small, thin sound, almost lost beneath the wind, coming from the ditch alongside the lane. He nearly walked past it, taking it at first for some trapped animal. Then it came again, unmistakably, a child's crying, muffled and exhausted, the kind of crying that had been going on so long it had worn itself down to almost nothing. He found the boy huddled against the frozen bank, no older than 6 or 7, in a coat too thin and too small, his lips gone pale with cold, his small hands tucked uselessly beneath his arms. "What is your name?" Edmund asked, crouching down, keeping his voice as gentle as he knew how, though gentleness was a muscle he had not exercised in some time. The boy only shook his head, too cold or too frightened to answer, and Edmund, without further debate, gathered him up. He weighed almost nothing, which troubled Edmund more than he wanted to examine just then, and carried him the remaining distance into the village of Thornfield, where lamplight showed at the windows and smoke rose from chimneys into the darkening sky. He did not know the village. He did not know which door to knock upon, but he saw, at the edge of the small high street, a light still burning in a low stone cottage with a sign above the door reading baker, and he made for it, because a baker's house would have warmth and food both, and the child in his arms needed both more urgently than anything else Edmund could offer. The door was opened by a young woman with flour-dusted hands and a candle held aloft against the dark, and Edmund saw, before he had said a single word, her whole face change at the sight of the child in his arms. Not surprise first, but something faster than surprise, a kind of immediate, unhesitating alarm that belonged entirely to the child and not at all to the strange man carrying him. "Bring him in, quickly, by the fire." She did not ask who Edmund was, or why he carried a stranger's child through the dark. She simply turned and led the way, and Edmund followed, ducking beneath the low doorframe into a small warm kitchen that smelled of yeast and wood smoke, where a banked fire still glowed in the hearth. "Set him here." She had already pulled a stool close to the fire and was reaching for a folded blanket from a chest near the wall. "What happened to him? Is he hurt? I found him in the ditch along the Thornfield road. I do not know how long he had been there. He would not give me his name." The young woman knelt before the boy, wrapping the blanket around his thin shoulders with quick, practiced hands, and began speaking to him in a low, steady voice that held none of the alarm Edmund had seen on her face a moment before, only warmth and patience, the voice of a person entirely unhurried despite the urgency of the moment. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name, sweetheart? Just your name if you can manage it." The boy's lips moved. Barely. Tom. That's a fine name.
I'm Margaret.
This is my father's bakery. You're gonna sit by this fire and get warm, and then we're gonna find you something to eat, and nothing bad is gonna happen to you here. Do you understand? The boy nodded, very small, and something in his thin shoulders loosened, just slightly, at the steadiness in her voice. Edmund stood back near the door, watching, and felt something shift and settle strangely in his chest. A feeling he could not immediately name, though he would come, in the days ahead, to understand it as the first crack in 4 years of careful, deliberate distance. Margaret rose from the hearth and looked properly, for the first time, at the man who had carried the child in. Edmund was aware, suddenly, of how he must appear. His fine coat spattered with mud from the road, his boots soaked through, no hat, having lost it somewhere on the walk and not troubled himself to retrieve it. He looked, he suspected, very little like a duke, and rather more like a gentleman who had met with some misfortune on the road, which was, in its way, entirely true. "You'll want to sit as well, sir," Margaret said. "You're near as cold as he is, by the look of your hands." She did not wait for his agreement, only pulled a second stool close to the fire and gestured him into it with the same brisk, unquestioning practicality she had shown the boy. "I'll bring broth for you both. There's little enough in the larder tonight, I'm afraid. My father is away at market in the next county and won't return till Thursday, and I've been careless about restocking while he's gone. But there's bread, and I can manage broth from what's left of yesterday's stew." She busied herself at the small hearth, and Edmund, watching her move, understood within a few minutes that little enough understated the matter considerably. He saw her reach for a single small loaf, the last one, by the look of the otherwise empty bread shelf, and cut it, without any hesitation at all, into 3 careful portions. One for the boy, one for Edmund, and after only the briefest pause, one for herself, though the last portion she cut noticeably thinner than the other 2. "Is that the last of your bread?" Edmund asked. "It will do for tonight," Margaret said, in a tone that closed the subject rather than answered the question, and Edmund understood, watching her set the boy's portion nearest the fire to keep it warm, that yes, it was the last of the bread, and that she had given the child and the stranger the larger shares without a single visible thought of doing otherwise. He had sat, in the past 3 weeks alone, at 4 separate dinners where silver dishes of food enough to feed a dozen families went half-eaten and were carried back to the kitchens to be thrown to the pigs. He had never once, in 34 years of comfortable plenty, watched anyone divide a last loaf of bread with such unthinking, unhesitating generosity, least of all toward a man she had never met, wearing mud-caked boots at her own hearth. "You did not have to share your own portion," he said quietly, once the boy, wrapped snug in his blanket, had begun to eat with the particular fierce hunger of a child who had gone too long without food. "He is a stranger's child in the cold, and you are a stranger who carried him 2 miles rather than leave him in a ditch," Margaret said, settling onto a low stool near the boy, watching him eat with a careful, unobtrusive attention that made certain he did not eat too fast to keep it down. "I would not have slept easy tonight knowing I had let either of you go hungry to save myself a thin supper. It is only bread, sir. There will be more of it baked by morning." Edmund looked at her properly then, in the firelight. A young woman, perhaps 25, in a plain wool dress with flour worked into the creases of her hands, her fair hair coming loose from its pins after what had clearly been a long day's work, her face open and unguarded in a way that struck Edmund, after 3 weeks of London drawing rooms full of carefully composed expressions, like something almost startling in its honesty. "What is your name?" he asked. "Your full name. You have given me a great deal of your last loaf, and I do not even know who to thank for it." "Margaret Wren," she said. "My father is the baker here, Thomas Wren, though we've a village full of Toms tonight, it seems." She glanced at the boy with a small, warm smile, and the boy, mouth full of bread, managed a shy answering smile of his own before returning his full attention to his broth. "And you, sir? You've the manner of a gentleman, if I may say so, wandering a country lane after dark with no hat and no servant in sight." Edmund hesitated. He had not planned this encounter, had not prepared any disguise or false name the way a more calculating man might have done in advance. But something in him, The same something that had shifted and settled at the sight of Margaret cutting her last loaf into 3 careful portions. Did not want, just yet, to say the word Duke into this small warm room and watch her face change the way every face changed at the sound of it. "My name is Edmund Hale," he said, which was true. "My carriage broke an axle on the Thornfield Road. I was walking ahead to find lodging when I heard the boy crying." He left the rest unsaid, the title, the estate, the 4 years of careful distance, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that Margaret did not press him for more, only nodded, as though a broken carriage and a gentleman's name were entirely sufficient explanation for anything. "Then you'll want the inn at the top of the street for the night, unless you'd rather stay by this fire a while longer and see the boy properly settled first," she said. "I sent my father's boy. He helps with deliveries, to fetch the constable's wife the moment I saw the child. She'll know if anyone in the village has lost a boy of his age. But it may be some hours yet before word comes back, given the weather." "I would rather stay," Edmund said, "if I am not in your way." "You are not in my way," Margaret said, and there was that small smile again, quick and unguarded. "Though you'll have to make do with a stool by the fire and whatever conversation a tired baker's daughter can manage after a full day's work." Edmund found, sitting there in the small warm kitchen with the smell of yesterday's bread still in the walls and a rescued child eating broth by the fire, that he wanted nothing more in the whole of that long, cold night than exactly that. Word came, near midnight, that the boy Tom was the son of a widowed farm laborer 3 miles distant, a man who had gone into Thornfield that morning to seek work and left the boy, briefly, with a neighbor who had, through some confusion never fully explained, lost track of him entirely by afternoon. The father arrived white-faced and weeping with relief, and gathered his son up with such raw, unguarded gratitude that Edmund had to look away from it, feeling, absurdly, as though he were intruding on something too private for a stranger's eyes. Margaret pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into the father's hands before he left, "For the walk home and for the morning until you can restock," and refused, gently but firmly, the man's stammered offer of the few coins in his pocket. "You've had a fright enough for one night, Mr. Cole," she said. "Keep your coin for the boy's boots. Those look near worn through." It was only after father and son had gone out into the cold, the door shutting behind them, that Edmund realized how late the hour had grown, and how he had made no move at all toward the inn Margaret had mentioned hours before. "I have kept you from your rest," he said, rising at last from his stool, his legs stiff from the long stillness of sitting. "I would not have slept easy regardless, not till I knew the boy was safe," Margaret said, and there was a tiredness in her voice now that she had kept carefully hidden while Tom needed steadiness from her. "You'll want the inn now, sir, before the hour grows later still. Mrs. Applewhite keeps a good fire and a fair price." Edmund paused at the door. He found, standing there with his hand on the frame, that he did not particularly want to walk out into the cold toward a stranger's inn, and that the wanting had very little to do with the weather and a great deal to do with the woman standing before him, tired and flour-dusted and entirely unaware of the effect she had had on a man who had believed, for 4 careful years, that this particular feeling was no longer available to him. "Miss Wren," he said, "thank you. For the boy. For the bread. For not asking questions a gentleman with no hat and no servant might have preferred not to answer tonight. You looked as though you'd had a hard enough evening without a stranger's questions added to it," Margaret said simply. "Good night, Mr. Hale. I hope your carriage is mended by morning." He walked to the inn through the softly falling snow, and lay awake a long while beneath a stranger's roof, thinking not of the broken axle, nor of the 3 weeks of London dinners behind him, but of a last loaf of bread cut into 3 careful portions, and a voice steady enough to calm a frightened, freezing child, and a face that had shown him, in the space of a single evening, more honest warmth than he had encountered in 4 long years of careful, deliberate distance. He told himself, as he finally drifted towards sleep, that he would leave Thornfield in the morning once his carriage was mended, and continue on toward his own cold, familiar house, and put the whole strange, warm evening carefully away as a pleasant memory and nothing more. He did not yet know how thoroughly he would fail to keep that promise to himself, nor that the very next morning would bring word, from his own coachman, of a matter far more urgent and far closer to Margaret Wren's door than either of them yet suspected. The knock came at Edmund's door at the inn just after dawn, and his coachman stood on the step with a face that told Edmund, before a single word was spoken, that the news was not good. The axle's mended, your grace, but that's not the trouble. I got to talking with the innkeeper last night, and with Mrs. Applewhite this morning over the fire. Seems the whole village is in an uproar. The land agent for the Thornfield estate, the old manor and its holdings, sold off in pieces these past 2 years since the last owner died without an heir, has been buying up the leases along the high street. Word is he means to clear the row for a new coaching inn and stables, now that the London road's to be widened next spring. Bakery, smithy, the lot of it. Every family with a lease is to be given notice by month's end. Edmund went very still. The bakery. Wren's bakery. Your grace. That one too, so I'm told. The daughter runs it mostly, her father being away. Seems a shame, from what the innkeeper says. Good honest business. Well liked in the village. Edmund thought of a last loaf of bread cut into 3 careful portions, and a voice steady enough to calm a frightened child, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing at all to do with the cold morning air. Who is the land agent? A Mr. Griswold, your grace. Acting for the new owner, though no one in the village seems to know the owner's name. Some London investor bought the whole estate at auction site unseen, they say, meaning to profit from the roadworks and be done with it. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, turning the matter over. He did not yet know who this London investor was. But he knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent a decade managing his own vast holdings, exactly how such purchases were financed, and exactly which solicitors in London handled such quiet, profitable land speculation. It would not take more than a day's inquiry, once he was back among his own resources, to learn the truth of it. Have the carriage brought round, Edmund said. But not yet toward home. I find my business in Thornfield is not yet finished. He returned to the bakery a little before midday, and found Margaret behind the counter, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, kneading a great mound of dough with quick, practiced strength, though there was a tightness around her eyes that had not been there the evening before. Mr. Hale. She looked up, and something like surprise, and beneath it a cautious warmth, crossed her face. I did not expect to see you again. I thought you'd be well on your way home by now. I heard the news this morning, Edmund said. About the leases. About Mr. Griswold and the coaching inn. Margaret's hands stilled on the dough. Then you've heard more than my father knows yet, and I've not found the courage to write and tell him. We've a month, Mr. Hale. A month to find another building, another livelihood, or watch everything my grandfather built be pulled down for a stable yard. She wiped flour from her hands with a cloth, and Edmund saw, beneath the brisk practicality she wore like armor, the same raw fear he had glimpsed for one unguarded moment the night before, watching her divide her last loaf without complaint. There must be some appeal, Edmund said carefully. Some way to petition the new owner directly, rather than through the agent. We've tried. Mr. Griswold says the owner will not be troubled with individual pleas, that the whole row is bought and the whole row will come down, and any family unwilling to vacate by the date given will be removed by the constable if need be. Margaret's jaw tightened. I have lived in the rooms above this shop my whole life, Mr. Hale. My mother died in the room above these very ovens. I do not know how to explain to my father, when he returns Thursday expecting the shop exactly as he left it, that a stranger in London has decided our whole lives are worth less than a stable yard. Edmund looked at her for a long moment, and made a decision that he would, in the days that followed, come to think of as the truest and most necessary decision of his adult life. Miss Wren, he said, I must tell you something, and I ask that you hear the whole of it before you judge me for not saying it last night. Something in his tone made her set down the cloth entirely and give him her full, wary attention. You are frightening me a little, Mr. Hale. I am not merely a gentleman whose carriage broke an axle, Edmund said. My name is Edmund Hale, that much was true. But I did not give you the whole of it. I am the Duke of Ellesmere. I did not tell you last night because, he paused, searching for the honest reason rather than a convenient one, because you looked at me, and at that frightened child, without once asking what either of us was worth to you, and I have not been looked at that way by a stranger in longer than I care to admit. I did not want the evening to change the moment you learned my title. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, one evening of being simply a man who carried a cold child in from the snow, and nothing more complicated than that. Margaret stared at him. Whatever she had braced herself to hear, it had not been this. A duke, she said slowly, sat on my kitchen stool eating thin broth and shared bread, and let me speak to him as though he were an ordinary gentleman with a broken carriage. Yes. And now you have come back to tell me so, on the very morning I learn my family's whole livelihood is to be pulled down for a coaching in. Something sharpened in her voice, a wariness Edmund understood entirely, though it still cost him something to hear it directed at himself. Forgive me if I wonder at the timing, Your Grace. I understand the wondering, Edmund said steadily. But I did not come to tell you my title so that you would owe me anything for it, nor to offer myself as some grand solution to a problem I only learned of this morning. I came because I could not, in good conscience, ride away from Thornfield knowing what I now know, and say nothing. I have resources you do not have, Miss Wren. I have solicitors and connections in London, and the means to learn within a day who this investor truly is and what might be done. I would like your permission to use those resources on your family's behalf. Nothing more is asked of you in return. Not gratitude, not anything else. Only your permission to help, because I find I cannot walk away and do nothing. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same frank, unhurried assessment she had given him the night before, when she had looked at his mud-caked boots and decided, without ever once weighing his worth by his coat, that he deserved a share of her last loaf regardless. You are asking my permission, she said slowly, rather than simply doing as you please, the way I imagine most men of your rank are accustomed to doing. I have learned, this past evening, that a kindness offered without permission is not entirely a kindness at all, Edmund said. You did not have to share your bread with me last night, Miss Wren. You chose to. I find I would rather you chose this as well, if choosing is a thing I can still offer you, given everything else about my rank that makes choosing difficult for people who depend on men like me. Something in Margaret's face softened, just slightly, at that. Then you have my permission, Your Grace. Though I will tell you plainly, if this proves to be pity dressed up as generosity, I would rather know it now than discover it later. It is not pity, Edmund said. I do not yet know entirely what it is. But it is not pity. It took 4 days for Edmund's London solicitor, working with the speed and discretion that came naturally to a man handling a duke's private business, to uncover the truth. The Thornfield estate had been purchased at auction by a consortium of 3 investors, one of whom, a Mr. Aldous Prynne, held the controlling share and had, in fact, previously attempted to purchase land adjoining Edmund's own northern estate 2 years past, a purchase Edmund had blocked at the time on the advice of his own land agent, who had considered Prynne's methods unscrupulous even by the standards of London speculation. Armed with this knowledge, and with a considerable amount of quiet leverage built over a decade of careful business dealings, Edmund did not threaten, nor did he plead. He simply made Mr. Prynne a very direct offer. The Duke of Ellesmere would purchase the entire Thornfield Row bakery, smithy, and every leased building upon it, at a price well above what Prynne had paid for the estate as a whole, on the sole condition that every existing lease be honored in full indefinitely at its current rate under new ownership. Prynne, who valued profit considerably more than principal, accepted within the week. Edmund did not go to Margaret directly with the news. He sent, instead, a plain letter, unsigned by any title, informing her only that the leases along the High Street had been secured under new ownership and that no family, including her own, would be required to vacate. He wanted her to have the relief of the news before she had to reckon, again, with the weight of who had provided it. He received 3 days later a letter in return. Your Grace, my father returned Thursday to find the shop exactly as he left it, and no notice of eviction waiting, and I have not yet found the courage to tell him precisely how that miracle came to pass. I think, perhaps, I have not fully found the courage to examine it myself. I do not know how to thank a duke for saving my family's whole livelihood, when everything I know of thanking a duke seems entirely too small for what has actually been done. I find myself wishing, selfishly, that you were still simply Mr. Hale with the broken carriage, so that I might know how to properly express what I feel without the weight of your rank standing between the feeling and the words. If you are ever again in Thornfield, and willing to sit on a kitchen stool and share whatever thin broth I have on hand, I should like very much to see you. Not the duke who bought a whole row of leases, but the man who carried a cold child 2 miles through the snow and asked my permission before doing anything more. Margaret Wren. Edmund read the letter 4 times, and then he called for his carriage. He returned to Thornfield a week later, in his own fine coat this time, in his own carriage bearing his own crest, because he had decided, riding down from London, that he owed Margaret Wren the honesty of arriving exactly as he was, rather than disguising himself a second time to spare either of them the weight of his title. The village, he discovered upon arrival, already knew. News of a duke's carriage having broken an axle on the Thornfield road, and of the mysterious new ownership of the High Street leases arriving within the same fortnight, had traveled through Thornfield with the particular speed such stories traveled in small places, and every soul on the street watched, with open curiosity, as the Duke of Ellesmere walked directly to the baker's door and knocked. Margaret opened it herself, flower on her hands as ever, and this time she did not simply usher him in toward the fire. She stood for a long moment in the doorway, looking at him properly, the fine coat, the crest on the carriage behind him, the whole undisguised weight of who he was, and Edmund made himself stand still and let her look, let her decide what she saw without hurrying her toward any conclusion. "You came in your own coat this time," she said finally. "I thought you had earned the honesty of it," Edmund said. "I did not want to hide behind Mr. Hale a second time, not when what I have come to say concerns the Duke as much as it concerns the man." "And what have you come to say, Your Grace?" Edmund drew a breath. He had planned this speech across the whole long ride from London, and found, standing now before her, that every careful word he had prepared had scattered entirely, leaving only the plain truth beneath them. "I have spent 4 years believing that the particular kind of warmth I felt for my late wife's memory, or rather, the warmth I never quite managed to feel for her, through no fault of her own, only through the coldness of an arrangement neither of us chose, was the only kind of warmth available to a man in my position. I believed that duty and distance were simply the price of the title, and I had made my peace with paying it. Then I carried a frightened child into your kitchen on the coldest night of the year, and watched you divide your last loaf of bread into 3 careful portions without a single moment's hesitation, and something in me that I believed had gone permanently quiet began, for the first time in 4 years, to make noise again." Margaret's eyes had gone bright, though she did not yet speak. "I do not ask you to become a duchess for the sake of becoming one," Edmund went on. "I have watched enough marriages built on titles and land to know exactly how hollow they can be. I ask you instead to consider a man who carried a child through the snow, and shared your thin broth and asked your permission before he tried to help, because I believe, I hope, that the man beneath the title is the one you might actually choose, if choosing is still a thing you are willing to do." For a long moment Margaret said nothing at all. Then she stepped back from the doorway, holding it open, and said, in a voice that had gone soft and unsteady with feeling, "You had better come in, Your Grace, before the whole street learns the whole of our business standing here in the cold." He went in. The fire was lit, the kitchen warm with the smell of fresh bread, and this time, when Margaret cut a loaf and divided it between them, she cut it in equal halves without hesitation, and handed him his share with a small, unguarded smile that told Edmund, more clearly than any words could have, exactly what her answer would be. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church at Thornfield, with the whole village crowded into pews meant for half their number, and the boy Tom, grown sturdier over the winter months on regular meals and warmer boots, stood at the front holding the rings on a small velvet cushion with an expression of ferocious, solemn concentration that made half the church smile through their tears. Margaret's father gave her away with tears streaming openly down his face, still only half able to believe that the strange, quiet gentleman who had once sat on his kitchen stool eating thin broth was in fact the Duke who now called him family. A year later, the bakery on Thornfield's High Street still stood, its lease honored exactly as promised, run now by a hired baker under Margaret's careful supervision. For she visited twice a week without fail, sleeves rolled, hands deep in dough, entirely unconcerned that a duchess was not, by any account she had ever heard, supposed to know the proper temperature for a well-risen loaf. At Ellesmere House, in the grand dining hall where 5 generations of solemn ducal portraits looked down from gilded frames, a new tradition had quietly taken root. Once a month, without fail, the kitchens baked a simple loaf of bread, plain and unadorned, and the Duke and Duchess of Ellesmere sat together and shared it, cut into careful, equal portions, exactly as it had been shared on the coldest night of the year that had changed both of their lives forever. And in the village of Thornfield, whenever a stray or hungry child wandered too near the baker's door, word had it that the door was always opened, and a portion was always found, no matter how little remained on the shelf, because the Duchess of Ellesmere, it was said, had never once in her life forgotten what it meant to share the last of what she had, and had raised her own children, in time, to understand that a full table was worth nothing at all if it could not be shared with someone who had none. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.